Rain tapped softly against the glass as the nurses wheeled him into the recovery room. The air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and that peculiar quiet that followed major surgery, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Machines beeped softly beside him, a steady rhythm of survival. His fingers twitched first. Then his eyelids fluttered. A nurse leaned over, her tone professional but kind. "Mr. Carrington, can you hear me? You've just come out of surgery. You might feel a little disoriented." His lips parted, dry and barely moving. But what came out stopped the nurse cold. "You're not Celeste. You're Valyria." The nurse froze. It wasn't her name. But that name, Valyria, it rolled off his tongue with such haunting familiarity that even the anesthesiologist beside her turned, puzzled. Mr. Carrington's heart monitor ticked on, unbothered, unaware that a single name had shattered something invisible in the air. Minutes later, when his sister arrived, she found him staring blankly at the ceiling. His eyes were open, lucid. But they weren't focused on the present. "Michael," she whispered, taking his hand, "you're safe. The surgery was successful." He blinked slowly. She was here. His sister frowned. "Who?" "The nurse." He shook his head, weakly but with certainty. "Valyria." Outside the room, a young woman paused, her coat soaked from the rain, her hands trembling as she held a coffee cup meant for someone who no longer recognized her. 3 days earlier, the world still hadn't unraveled. It was late autumn in the city, and the morning fog had draped itself over the skyline like a thick blanket. In his penthouse overlooking the river, Michael Carrington had been preparing for his long-awaited surgery, alone. He had chosen to delay it for months, despite doctors warning him about the risks. But something in him had held off, as if waiting for a sign. That sign had come in the form of a woman with eyes like evening storms and a name he had almost forgotten, Celeste. Only that wasn't her name. When she had appeared at his door a month ago, coffee in hand, claiming to be from the care agency, he hadn't questioned it. He didn't recognize her face, but something in her voice, so familiar, so warm, had soothed him. He didn't ask why she lingered longer than necessary. Why she hummed old tunes while setting down his medications. Or why her hands always trembled slightly when she touched his. She was efficient, polite, always present at 8 a.m. sharp with his coffee exactly how he liked it. But there was a sadness in her eyes, something that said, "I'm not just here for the paycheck." And each morning, when she brought the coffee to his bedside, she whispered, "It's just how you used to like it." He had never corrected her. Because somehow, he believed her. 6 years earlier, before the diagnosis, before the hospital visits and the pills lined up like soldiers, Michael Carrington had been someone else entirely. He had been ruthless, brilliant, feared in the boardroom. But there had been one crack in that armor, a night in Paris, a name murmured beneath breath, a woman who disappeared before dawn. He had awoken alone, a necklace on the pillow beside him, and a single note, "When the world forgets, remember me. V." He never found her. Until she walked through his door again, under a false name, holding coffee and memories. He hadn't remembered her fully. Not at first. Faces blur over time, and the past gets repainted with the colors of regret and imagination. But when she stood beside his bed before surgery, brushing his hair gently from his forehead, her fingers lingered too long. Her breath caught. "You don't have to be alone for this," she whispered. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to die. In the surgical waiting room, she sat quietly with her hands clasped tightly, trying to hide the tremble in her fingers. She had no legal right to be there. No title. No surname that matched his. Just a memory in his heart that even anesthesia couldn't silence. Now, post-surgery, with his words hanging in the air like ghosts, everyone started asking questions. The nurse reviewed the intake records again. There was no Valyria listed in his emergency contacts. No mention of a woman by that name anywhere in his files. But Michael kept repeating it. She was here. She held my hand. She's real. His sister confronted the agency. Celeste hadn't clocked in. There was no employee by that name. She had used a fake badge, a fake profile. Security cameras showed her arriving each day like clockwork. Polite, kind, smiling. Unremarkable in the way only someone trying to remain invisible could be. But when his sister paused the footage on a close-up, she gasped. Michael, in his younger years, had kept a single photograph in his office. A picture from a business gala in Paris, barely candid, almost forgotten. In it, he stood beside a woman with stormy eyes and a smile that never made it to her eyes. "That's her," his sister whispered. "That's Valyria. But why come back now? Why pretend?" The answers wouldn't come from files or cameras. They were hidden in the folds of 6 years lost, in the ache between two people who never had a proper goodbye. And in the next chapter, the truth would begin to bleed out, one memory at a time. 6 years before that hospital bed and the name that shattered silence, the city breathed under a heavy snowfall. The streets shimmered with amber from the street lamps, and downtown Charleston wore a quiet kind of elegance that only winter could give. In a corner cafe called Elliot's, nestled between two bookstores, a young woman with dark auburn hair sat curled near the window, her fingers red from the cold, wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup. She was a shadow then. Just a silhouette moving through a world that rarely noticed her. Her name wasn't Celeste, not then. Not ever. She was Valyria. A name passed down from her grandmother who believed names carried destinies. But Valyria had learned to hide her name like a secret too delicate for the world's clumsy hands. In her barista uniform with the faded green apron and mismatched buttons, she was just V to the customers. Just another girl with tired eyes and a polite smile. That day had been long. 3 shifts. No lunch. Rent was due in 5 days. Her roommate had just moved out without notice. But when the front bell of the cafe chimed and a man in a gray wool coat walked in, shaking snow from his shoulders, everything else in her world paused. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the sort of posture that told you he didn't bend often, not to time, not to people, not to emotion. His name, though she didn't know it then, was Elias Calderon. The heir to Calderon Medical Group. A man who had just signed a multi-million-dollar research deal that morning, and who'd been forced by his younger brother to celebrate with a real cup of coffee, instead of some executive lounge champagne. Valyria didn't notice him at first. She was too busy wiping down a table, humming quietly to herself, her voice barely a whisper. But Elias heard it. And something about the tone, a softness that didn't belong in this city of steel and ambition, made him turn his head. "Do you know the name of the song you were humming?" he asked. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide under messy bangs. "Oh. I'm sorry. Was it too loud?" "No," he said. "It was just familiar." She tilted her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's called Magnolia Waltz. My grandmother used to play it on the piano when I was little. I guess it got stuck somewhere in me." Elias nodded, though the song meant nothing to him. But the way she said it, like memories mattered, stirred something. He ordered a black coffee, paid in cash, and took a seat near the window. She returned to her duties, but his eyes followed her when she wasn't looking. The snow outside turned heavier. Customers left. The cafe dimmed. And when the lights flickered once, twice, then died, the silence between them grew loud. Valyria lit a candle near the counter. "The breaker's fussy. This place is older than it looks." Elias chuckled. "Do you always stay this calm in the dark?" She shrugged. "Dark doesn't scare me. It's forgetting that scares me." That response, raw, unscripted, clung to him longer than it should have. 10 minutes passed. No power. No other customers. Just the two of them. And when she brought him a complimentary croissant for being the last brave soul here, he said, "What's your name?" "V," she replied automatically. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean your real name." She hesitated. It wasn't just a name to her. It was a piece of her grandmother. Of everything she had before the fire. But something about him, his stillness, the way he asked, not demanded, made her answer. "Valyria." He smiled. Not a smirk. Not the polite grin she'd seen from so many men who assumed kindness was an invitation. A real smile. The kind people rarely wore in public anymore. "Valyria," he repeated. "That's a name that lingers." She didn't know what to say to that. So she just nodded, then turned to refill the sugar canister, but her hands trembled. She hated that. How one name, spoken the right way, could stir everything she'd worked to bury. Before he left, he asked for her recommendation on books. She pointed him next door to the used bookstore run by Mr. Finch, an old veteran who sold more stories than novels. Elias asked if she'd walk him there. She hesitated. But he waited, patiently, as if he already knew she would say yes. They crossed the snow-covered sidewalk in silence. And when they entered the warm-lit store, she picked up a worn copy of Neruda's poems and handed it to him. "Page 37, she said. He flipped to it. "Read the first line out loud. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees." He looked up, something flickering behind his gaze. But all he said was, "Thank you." He left that night with the book and nothing more. No number. No last name. Not even a promise to return. Just the lingering echo of her name, and the scent of lavender she wore too faintly. Valyria stood by the cafe window long after he was gone, watching the snow swallow his footsteps. She didn't expect to see him again. And that was fine. It was just a moment. A thread in a very frayed tapestry. Except 2 days later, a man in a suit returned. He left a package. No note. No sender. Inside was a single magnolia flower, pressed in a glass frame. And beneath it, written in the exact cursive of Neruda's poem, was one line. "Don't forget the name that lingers." Valyria touched the glass, unsure whether to smile or cry. She didn't know his name. But she remembered his voice. 3 years passed. Cities changed. People did, too. But memory had a way of curling itself into corners of the soul that no time or logic could reach. Valyria no longer worked at Eliot's. After Mr. Finch passed away and the cafe shuttered during the pandemic, she'd taken a job at a private recovery facility in Vermont, hidden behind mountains and mist, where wealthy patients healed from surgeries in silence and solitude. Her role was simple: post-op care assistant. Change bandages. Refill water. Ensure their bodies remembered how to be alive, even when their hearts had forgotten. She liked the quiet. The lack of questions. Here, everyone had secrets, and no one was brave enough to ask about another's. It suited her. She didn't speak of Charleston. Of her grandmother's piano. Of a magnolia pressed in glass. She'd tucked that memory into a small drawer of her mind labeled, "Too Unreal." Until patient 314 checked in. No name. Just numbers. That was how some of them preferred it. High-profile patients. CEOs. He arrived after dusk in an armored vehicle with black-tinted windows. His assistant filled out the paperwork. Emergency eye surgery. Privacy requested. She didn't see him at first, only the top of his chart, corneal transplant, bilateral. "He'll be asleep for most of the first 2 days," the nurse supervisor said. "You're assigned to his recovery window. Don't speak unless spoken to." She nodded. It was routine. Mechanical. But when she stepped into his recovery room the next morning, something inside her cracked. Even with the bandages wrapped over his eyes and tubes laced around his arms, there was something unmistakable about the shape of his jawline, the slope of his brow, the quiet tension in his fingers. She told herself it wasn't him. Couldn't be him. Elias Calderon, if that had ever truly been his name, was just a story she told herself on rainy nights. A one-night memory preserved in poetry and dust. But when she read the side tag clipped to his chart, her breath caught. The initials weren't 314. They were EC. She should have left. Asked for reassignment. Pretended not to care. Instead, she sat. And stayed. And for the first time in 3 years, she hummed. Only softly. Just a few notes. Barely more than a whisper. But it was Magnolia Waltz. Because something irrational inside her needed him to remember, even if he couldn't see. Even if he'd never open his eyes again. His vitals stayed steady. She whispered instructions. Squeeze once if you're in pain. He never did. On the second night, a snowstorm rolled in. Wires buzzed. The facility generator hiccuped once, then caught. The backup lights glowed a dull amber. Valyria sat beside his bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold. She studied him, not like a nurse studies a patient, but like someone trying to remember a dream from childhood. And then, he moved. Not much. Just his lips. A breath. And a word. She leaned in, not sure if she imagined it. Magnolia. She gasped. Her tea slipped from her lap, splashing onto the floor. He hadn't opened his eyes. But that voice, it was his. The same voice that had once read Neruda aloud and asked for her real name without hesitation. He was dreaming. Maybe dying. Maybe neither. But he had remembered. She stood, uncertain whether to run or cry or laugh. Instead, she whispered back, "Do you know who I am?" Silence. Then, barely audible, he said, "The name that lingers." Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the bed. He remembered. Not everything. Maybe not her face. But enough. Enough to make the years between them feel like a film she could rewind. She stayed by his side until dawn. But the next day, her supervisor called her in. "You've been reassigned," the woman said curtly. The patient's team requested someone new. Valyria blinked. Did he request that? They did. Not him. She didn't argue. But as she packed her things into her bag, her hands trembled. She returned one last time that night, unofficially. Just to check his chart. To say goodbye. She found his room empty. "Where's patient 314?" she asked the orderly in a panic. "Discharged this morning. Airlifted. Emergency complications. Didn't leave a note." Of course not. Rich men didn't write notes. They disappeared. They forgot. But when she returned to her locker, there was something inside she hadn't placed there. A small square box. Inside, a dried magnolia. Pressed. And beneath it, folded in neat script. "Your name stayed with me. Even when everything else went dark. But I still don't know if I dreamed you, or failed to find you in time." She clutched the note to her chest. Tears she hadn't known she still carried slipped from her eyes. She didn't know where he'd gone. But she knew now, he hadn't forgotten. Not completely. The sun pierced the frost-bitten skies of Vermont with a cruel brightness that morning, flooding through the windows of the high-rise suite in Manhattan where Elias Calderon now lay awake. His eyes, newly baptized with sight, blinked against the white gold of morning as if tasting light for the very first time. Machines beeped steadily. Nurses murmured in the hallway. A soft classical piece hummed faintly through hidden speakers, something he had once loved. Maybe still did. The surgery was a success. That's what they told him. He should have been relieved. Instead, Elias felt as though someone had opened his eyes not to the world, but to everything he had forgotten. And one word echoed in him like a name engraved into bone. Valyria. Not Celeste. Not Camille. Not the models or muses or women he dated and discarded like seasons. Valyria. The woman with storm-colored eyes and a voice like forgotten poetry. He sat up too fast, his vision still adjusting, and the pain throbbed at the base of his skull. But he didn't care. Because for the first time in years, his mind was clear, and he knew what he had to do. He called for his assistant. "Get me the Vermont facility," he rasped. 3 nights ago. Post-op nurse. I need her name. Sir. Just get me the damn name, Elias whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make her disappear again. It took hours. Red tape. Privacy rules. But Elias owned half the state's hospital systems, and the right signatures unlocked doors. Her name came through in an encrypted email, Valyria Finch. The surname hit him like a lightning strike. Mr. Finch's Cafe. The girl who read Neruda to herself on rainy mornings. The one who disappeared without saying goodbye. He remembered everything now. The night they met. The waltz under the magnolia trees. The promise he never kept. And how he'd searched, but never hard enough. Until now. By nightfall, he was on a private jet. He had no plan. Just a name. And a prayer. Valyria sat cross-legged on the floor of her new apartment in Albany, a box of children's books beside her and a lukewarm bowl of lentil soup balanced on her knee. Life was modest, quiet. Her small tutoring business kept the rent paid, and her heart a safe distance from danger. She didn't expect visitors. Certainly not the knock at her door just before midnight. She peered through the peephole. And gasped. He was standing there. In a dark wool coat, hair tousled by wind, eyes like winter storms, but clearer now. Sharper. Alive. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, neither moved. Then she opened the door. Elias, she whispered. Like the name had been waiting behind her lips this whole time. He looked at her, eyes full of 1,000 unspoken things. And then, softly, like someone waking from a coma, he said, Valyria. Not a question. A declaration. Tears stung her eyes. You remember. Not everything, he said. But enough. She stepped back to let him in. He didn't rush. He didn't touch her. He simply walked into the tiny apartment like it was a cathedral. There were no chandeliers. No marble floors. Just a worn rug. A chipped mug on the table. A crayon drawing of a tree taped to the fridge. And a photograph on the bookshelf. Of a boy. Their boy. Elias moved toward it slowly, as if afraid to break it just by looking. His fingers hovered above the frame, trembling. Then turned toward her. You never told me. You never asked, she whispered. Silence stretched between them like a wound. I thought it was just one night, he said, barely audible. But I never forgot your name. I didn't know why, until you said it to me in that room. Valyria nodded. I didn't know if it was real. You were rich. Powerful. I was a waitress reading poetry to ghosts. What was I supposed to do? Call your PR manager and say, hey, remember me? We danced once under a magnolia tree. Elias smiled. A real one. Not perfect. Not polished. Just human. I should have remembered. I should have found you. You were blind, she said. I was blind long before I lost my eyes. They stood in that truth together. Both changed. Both softer. Both cracked open by time. Then a soft rustle came from the hallway. Little feet. Bare toes on tile. A sleepy voice. Mom. Valyria turned. It's okay, baby. Come here. The boy, no older than 4, peeked around the corner, rubbing his eyes. He looked up at Elias. Then back at his mother. Elias knelt down, heart pounding. And the boy, without fear, walked into his arms. He didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. Children always know. I drew you a tree, the boy whispered. I saw, Elias choked. It's beautiful. Valyria watched as her son curled into the arms of a man he had never met, but somehow already knew. And she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. When Elias looked up again, tears streaked his cheeks. I don't expect anything. I just want to know him. To know you again. Even if it's from a distance. She walked toward them, placed her hand on his shoulder. You don't have to watch from a distance, she said. He looked up, eyes wide. You can stay, she said softly. If you mean it. If you remember not just my name, but who I was when I gave it to you. I remember, he said, pressing her hand to his chest. And I'll never forget again. Outside, the first snow of spring began to fall, gentle, silent, like petals from some invisible bloom. Inside, a family, broken once by time and silence, began to form again. Not with fireworks, but with names remembered. And the quiet grace of a second chance.